Evaluating the validity and accuracy of the PEAK-E assessment and the PEAK-E curriculum in a single case evaluation across 3 individuals with autism by Kara Lucas. A quick summary of this study is that it evaluated the validity, reliability, and accuracy of the PEAK-E assessment and curriculum. It looked at 3 individuals with autism, and it showed that all participants were able to demonstrate derived responses using the PEAK-E curriculum. Over the past 40 years, the prevalence of ASD has tenfold, and a common statistic is that 1 in 68 children are identified with ASD. The DSM criterion for ASD says persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts. Majority of the deficits that we see in a lot of children and people with ASD is the language deficits. For years, the field has utilized Skinner's theory of verbal behavior to help with developing language in populations experiencing language deficits. No doubt, Skinner has been the father of our field. He analyzes language just as any non-verbal behavior goes. Our behaviors are shaped by our environment, just as Skinner says. Verbal behavior has a widely successful intervention component in the world of ABA and in the intervention with individuals with autism. Skinner's verbal behavior was developed in 1957, and since then the field has grown to study more complex behaviors, just as a natural evolution of the field. We study behaviors like perspective taking and temporal reasoning and problem solving, which now has caused more contemporary ABA approaches to evolve. These include things such as stimulus equivalence, RFT, and name theory. RFT and stimulus equivalence in particular have been an inspiration behind the PEAK equivalence module. What is RFT and what is stimulus equivalence? So RFT is just a continuation of verbal behavior. Hayes proposes that derived relational responding is another verbal operant. Relational framing is placing stimuli into various relational frames, giving contextual cues. A relational frame is a unit of responding and a functional behavior. There are a number of frames, but the one in particular that I will talk about is frame of coordination. This in particular looks at stimulus equivalence. For example, stimulus A is the same as stimulus B. Stimulus equivalence looks at accurate responding stimulus to stimulus relations that are not directly trained or reinforced. Stimulus equivalence is tested by looking for reflexivity, symmetry, and transitivity among given stimulus to stimulus relations. It's similar to mathematical statement. If A is B and then B is C, then A is C. Research has embarked on ways that we can really help develop certain skills in this population of individuals. And one way that Hayes proposes that we do this is to look at those contemporary approaches like stimulus equivalence and relational frame theory and really work on the derived relational responding piece as an overarching skill to teach versus just teaching things naturally through the content. This is a little bit different than your traditional approaches, which focus on the content, whereas Hayes proposes that we need to focus on the skill itself of teaching them how to derive these relations. And another really cool piece of literature that shows that this derived relational responding piece can be done at a really young age was done by Luciano, Gomez, and Valverde in 2007. They showed that a 15-month-old infant was actually able to derive symmetrical relations. In this field, we are data-driven. We use assessments, which are tools that guide our intervention and treatment plans for our individuals with developmental disabilities. These assessments need to be valid and they need to be reliable. They need to measure what we intend them to measure and really uncover those deficits that we need to find for these individuals. The VB map is a popular and useful tool in the ABA field. However, there is no published study supporting the relative validity or reliability On the other hand, the PEAK direct training module shows a strong IOA data. In addition, Dixon et al. In 2015 showed that individuals with a total PEAK score of 138 out of 368 possible had all the skills that were assessed in the VB map. Essentially, there is this ceiling effect with the VB map. It caps out at a certain age. So then you don't have skills that you can continually work on, whereas the PEAK encompasses more skills. It is important to the field to understand the degree to which these assessments used measure what they intend to measure. Some things we need to look at for these assessments include construct validity and content validity, which looks at the basis of the causal relationship between the intervention and the behavior change. Another type of validity assessments should measure is criterion validity. Criterion validity or training validity will require assessments to A. Identify skills that individuals are and are not able to perform outside of the assessment setting, and B. Skills that the individual is able to acquire. A lot of treatment and intervention research relies on group designs, which primarily uses this gold standard for intervention, which is randomized controlled trials. But the problem with group designs is they generalize their results. So this whole group gets condensed into an average number, and it's supposed to be applicable to every individual, which isn't always the case. Single case designs do it a little bit different. They use repeated assessments over time. But why is this so important that we need to use this single case design in order to discover the validity and efficacy? Well, increasing numbers of developmentally delayed populations do not need generalized results on treatments that may or may not be useful on a majority of similar individuals, but rather what assessments and treatments that can specifically be effective across individuals or across a specific individual. Many language assessments lack the efficacy and validity, which our field strives to embody. However, the present study seeks to evaluate the criterion validity and efficacy of the PEAK equivalent module for individuals with autism. The PEAK-E has incorporated the field's basic original operants, explored new empirical territory, which was suggested by Hayes and Sidman, including stimulus equivalence and RFT. Previous research has already demonstrated the PEAK-E's effectiveness in teaching individuals with disabilities to derive relations, including studies that look at derived relations related to WH questions, rule-governed behaviors in social games, and even learning geometry. It bridges the gap between the highly technical language in the scientific community, and it makes it more approachable for others, such as clinicians, parents, educators, and other professionals. Most importantly, it sets out to uphold our field's defining principles of having effective, evidence-based assessments. The current study aims to determine if the combined results of the PEAK pre-assessment and the PEAK assessment are effective in providing individualized targets for each of the participants in the study, and 2, if the identified skills from the PEAK-E assessment were skills that the participants were not already able to perform those skills outside of the assessment, and 3, if the PEAK-E curriculum was effective in teaching the targeted skills, meaning that the identified skills were indeed skills that the participant is able to learn, and 4, if following the directly training a subset of skills, the individuals were successfully able to derive untrained relations. Ultimate goal of the PEAK-E is being able to derive untrained relations. Ultimately, this evaluation will help expand upon the growing body of literature that is supporting the PEAK-E relational training system for individuals with autism, while overall promoting a need for efficacy and validity amongst language development assessments used in the field of applied behavior analysis. Participants and settings. In this study, the participants were 2 boys and 1 girl. All had the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. All of them received in-home ABA services at the same company, and they were all from a large Midwestern city. The materials in the study include the Peak E pre-assessment, the Peak E assessment, and the Peak E curriculum. Each participant had 3 programs in which they worked on, and the Peak E curriculum had the given materials for each program. The Peak E pre-assessment also had materials within the Peak E and were made up of arbitrary stimuli. As a quick walkthrough of what the procedure really looked like in the study, the first thing to do is to conduct the long form of the Peak E pre-assessment, and how the participants scored in the pre-assessment predicts where to begin in the Peak E assessment. After completing the pre-assessment, we moved on to conducting the Peak E equivalence assessment. And if any point in time during the assessment the participant was not able to do 3 consecutive skills in the assessment, then we stopped the assessment and moved into teaching the curriculum in those programs that the kiddo missed. After the curriculum was completed and the child was able to master those 3 skills, then we went back in to test the Peak E equivalence again to see if they were able to derive any relations on any other skills within the assessment. In baseline, all the specific relations in the program were addressed, including both the train and test relations. We completed a series of trial blocks until a pattern was revealed. No reinforcement or social praise interaction was provided to the participant for correct or incorrect responses during baseline, and the instructor used a neutral tone of voice. The experimenter did give the participant a short break, about 2 to 3 minutes in between trial blocks, and this was not contingent upon performance. The treatment sessions consisted of both the train and test conditions, where the train conditions, the participant received corrective feedback if necessary, and we used least to most intrusive prompting. After the correct response was emitted by the participants, social praise and a preferred reinforcer was given. However, during the test trials, it was a little bit more similar to baseline, where there was no corrective feedback given and there was a neutral tone of voice used. Each participant was granted a 2 to 3 minute break after each trial block, and this was not contingent upon their performance. Here are all the Peak E curriculum programs that were worked on across each participant. All the participants worked on symmetry programs. Measurement and reliability. The dependent variable was the Peak E scores and the percentage correct scores. Calculated Peak E scores range from 0 to 10. As you can see on here, there's the response scoring. For IOA, 31% of the experimental trials had a second observer score the participants' responses from a recorded video, and 33% of the trials in the Peak E pre-assessment and Peak E assessment were completed with a second observer, same way with a recorded video. 88% IOA for the experimental sessions, 100% for the Peak pre-assessment, and 91% for the Peak EA. For results, here in the table to the left, you can see that the Peak pre-assessment results are listed. Amy had a total score of 25, Chris had a total score of 15, and Sam had a total score of 2. To the right here, you can see the Peak E pre and post assessment results. You can see that Amy initially scored a 47, and after intervention or completing the Peak E curriculum programs, she was able to score a 54 on the post assessment. Chris scored 14 on the Peak E on the Peak E assessment, and he had a pretty significant jump up to 26 after intervention. And then for Sam, he scored a 29 on the Peak E assessment initially, and then after intervention and working on those Peak E curriculum programs, he scored a 38. As seen with the graphs here, Amy was able to derive the relationships across all 3 programs tested. Chris also showed significant increase in his ability to derive relations across all 3 programs. Sam was also able to derive relations when tested after many train trials across all 3 programs. The results from the current study demonstrate the methods outlined in the peak equivalence module assessment and curriculum are valid, reliable, and effective. During this study, the peak pre-assessment demonstrated that these individuals did not have a significant ability to derive specific relations already in his or her repertoire. After treatment, each participant was able to acquire the targeted skill from the curriculum. Maintenance probes were also very successful, and after successful implementation of the peak curriculum, these individuals were able to derive relations and even increase their overall peak scores. As you can see with the chart to the right, you can see that improvement. Overall, the results from the study demonstrate that the skill for derived relational responding was emerging across all of the individuals post-intervention. For some further analysis, Amy, specifically when working on the symmetry region capitals, she needed more prompting initially, and this program was all vocal stimuli, and this was consistent with what her IEP had stated. Her IEP has in place some, textual prompts or some assisted aid when it comes to a lot of that vocal stimuli. So this program was a little bit more difficult for her, but she was still able to, derive those relationships over a period of time. Chris's skill acquisition was rapid during the treatment condition. However, once intervention ensued, Chris was able to effectively demonstrate many of the targeted skills, and his performance was consistent with something called immediate transfer, where a participant reaches a predetermined mastery criteria right when the first test relationship is assessed. Many times test relation does not occur immediately, and it can require more exposure to those training trials. However, the immediate transfer test relation solidifies the idea that Chris was able to derive the correct relations based on the training trials. Repeated trials and testing trials can expose the participant to other contingencies, such as advantageous feedback. This you can kind of see with Sam. This is where the participant has repeated train test trials until the criterion performance emerges, which may cause some indirect feedback. And we saw this a little bit with Sam. He would go in and out of those test and train trials. So the participant may think, I keep getting the same problem, and then maybe that answer is wrong. So Diamond and Reinfeld in 2002 noted that if you have limited choices or two-choice procedures, that could cast doubt on the transfer performance. However, in order to really combat that, all of the participants' field size for stimuli was at least 3 or more. In addition, the mastery criteria for the test relations was 80% correct responding across the trial blocks, which ensues greater experimental control and less likely that the transfer stimulus was related to, that indirect feedback or just your basic testing exposures. The study demonstrates contribution of literature to the accuracy and validity of the peak E assessment that is already existing. The single case design in the study allows researchers to view the individual performance of each participant in the study, and overall, this study contributes to the existing literature regarding the entire peak relational training system. Some key points to take away from this study is that the peak E assessment demonstrated the ability to predict specific outcomes, which include that individuals with ASD can accurately derive untrained relations when utilizing the peak E curriculum. This is increasingly important due to the rise of individuals with developmental disabilities and that need for individualized assessments and treatment plans for individuals, since we've seen such a rise. Just like any other body of research, there are limitations within this study. The first one is experimental sessions were spread out across a span of months. The individuals were very busy individuals as far as they had in-home ABA therapy, outside extracurricular activities. So it really came down to when was the best time to schedule things with the experimenter and with the family and the participants as well. So it kind of caused a little bit more of an elongated process and not a back-to-back experimental sessions. Another limitation to the study is that the experimenter had limited prior exposure with the participants. So Chris and Sam both had zero exposure to the experimenter, whereas Amy had very limited exposure. The experimenter did not have any direct sessions with any of these participants, so that lack of exposure could have also led to, longer time to acquire some of the skills as well. The next important thing to note, Chris seemed to be a little prompt dependent during the assessment and the pre-assessment. He would often respond with phrases like "I don't know" or "I need help." Chris and Sam are both brothers, and as you can see in their Peak E pre-assessment and post-assessment scores, they had significant differences. Chris did much better in the pre-assessment, but not as many skills in the actual assessment, whereas Sam, had a relatively low score in the pre-assessment, but had a higher number of skills within the assessment. The main reason behind this is Chris was younger and Sam was older, and Sam actually did have a lot of skills that Chris did not, as far as being able to read, being able to write, and a lot of those skills that were assessed in the Peak E assessment, Chris was not able to do, so that's why you see a little bit of the difference there. Some other limitations include that the study was only done in the participants' homes, so it wasn't done across a variety of environments, so it was not generalized across environments. The only participant that did have the opportunity to generalize across environments was Amy. We conducted one session in autism center, and then the rest of them were in the in-home setting. Another limitation is that there was only 3 participants and that only 3 Peak E programs were explored. Future research includes completing the assessment until there are 5 consecutive skill deficits that are found. The Peak equivalence module does state to complete the Peak E assessment until there are 5 deficits found. So a future study can follow that protocol set in the assessment. Another thing is that the Peak E is designed to be completed in multiple environments. So completing this in a school or across different communities or, and across different homes, just those different settings would be a good exploration for future research. Another thing to think about for future research is to use other individuals outside of autism. There's a lot of developmental disabilities other than autism. Even though autism is the most prevalent, it would be a really neat thing to see how Peak can be really effective, possibly for other populations. And then also to explore how Peak E scores relate to other educational curriculums, such as IQ tests. In conclusion, the current study highlights the importance of utilizing stimulus equivalence and RFT to teach individuals with developmental disabilities more complex behaviors, specifically related to cognition and language. Dixon's 2015 Peak E module is able to utilize stimulus equivalence, RFT, multiple exemplar training, and more in order to create this effective assessment. This study really set out to look at the efficacy and validity surrounding the Peak module surrounding a language assessment, and it is really steadfast with Beowulf and Riesle's 1968 defining principles of our field, one of which is being effective. So it is really important to our field that we have these effective assessments that we can use. And that is the conclusion of my thesis defense. So if there are any questions, you can address them to me, and I would be happy to answer them. Thank you for watching.